During the Vietnam War, soldiers were faced with constant fear and tension. The men often had time between battles with no action where they always feared being attacked or running into a trap. Downtime also led to boredom where soldiers felt loneliness and were haunted by the war. To break the tension, soldiers would have dark humor, drink, do drugs, and other activities to pass the time.
Many of these soldiers were far from their homes, fighting a war in a country that they may have not known existed before. Battles were brutal and took a real toll on soldiers who survived them. Even after battle, there was always a constant built-up fear of the unknown and attacks popping up at any time.
When they had free time, what did they do? They needed to pass time and stay alert. With the constant tension, soldiers would do anything to break it. Soldiers say that you saw and heard some of the darkest humor. Some soldiers would play a game where they threw bayonets at each other's feet, and after each throw they got closer. One soldier said if they injured themselves they would have to deal with it, but they didn't care. They just did anything to break the tension. Soldiers also had to cope with the loneliness, so prostitution was common in the country. Soldiers also gambled to pass time. They coped with boredom by playing sports too. Games like basketball and volleyball were played on base. They also played tournaments amongst the platoons. The men in their downtime also focused on improving their bodies and staying in shape. Soldiers worked out as much as they could, but it was so hot and humid they often could not stand being exposed to the weather that long.
Drug use was a serious problem in Vietnam, especially from 1968 onward. Drugs were used to stay alert and cope with pain, both physical and mental. A Department of Defense study revealed in 1968 just over half of the American servicemen in Vietnam used drugs. By 1970, that number had risen to more than 60%. By the time of the American withdrawal in 1973, the DoD estimated that almost 70% of American servicemen in Vietnam had used some type of illicit drug. The most common drugs used were marijuana and amphetamines. Cheap and readily available, drugs provided an escape from anxiety and boredom prevalent among combat soldiers.
Drugs weren't the only problem. Drinking was popular during the war because it was believed to relieve stress. It was not looked upon as bad by the higher-ups either. And 24/7 bar service was offered to the soldiers during the war because of the long shifts that the soldiers had to take keeping watch. Soldiers would receive alcohol and supply drops as well.
Along with drugs and drinking, smoking cigarettes was also a very common escape for the soldiers. It was cheap, and the men felt that they always needed one. Soldiers smoked constantly because no one knew about any harmful side effects, but even if they did, they probably wouldn't have cared because they needed cigarettes. Cigarettes could take off the edge and help a soldier through stressful moments during the war or during a battle. Cigarettes were not hard to get either. They even came in C-ration meals, so soldiers always had them. Soldiers would even occasionally carry a box of cigarettes on their helmet so that they always had one.
Many of the men left hobbies and interests behind at home. The 1960s were great years for music, and the soldiers spent a good amount of time making and listening to music. Music enabled countless soldiers in Vietnam to connect with each other and the world back home, helping them cope with the complexities of war they had been sent to fight. Many of the men listened to daily American radio shows for music, comedy, and the news.
Soldiers also closely followed sports back home. American soldiers could not connect to the culture of Vietnam. It was very unfamiliar to them. So music helped them stay connected to life back home. Music like The Temptations, Jimi Hendrix, and CCR were very popular amongst the soldiers because they could connect well to the lyrics of the songs. Music during the Vietnam War also brought a generation gap between the higher-ups in the military and the younger soldiers. The young American soldiers on base preferred a more rebellious, rowdy music. This music was deemed inappropriate by the higher-ups and was often not allowed to be played on base radio stations. However, soldiers still loved to listen to this music. To many soldiers, musical instruments were prized possessions that they brought overseas with them. Some soldiers would spend time playing the guitar and singing. Just to cope with stress, soldiers would sing about their experiences in Vietnam. Soldiers could now express themselves and have a way to cope with the fear and break the tension. The Vietnam War was filled with lots of violence, stress, and fear, and soldiers were pushed to their breaking points constantly. The only things that kept them going and kept them from going completely crazy was dark humor, drinking, drugs, and other activities like hunting, sports, and gambling. Music also helped them cope with their issues and allowed them to express themselves. This is how the soldiers spent their free time during the Vietnam War.